Hello and welcome back to my channel. The topic I've picked today to talk about is our stories. We've all got them. No one's excluded from this. They may vary in depth and severity and all of those kind of things, but none of us escape this world without developing some stories that we tell about ourselves from experiences we've had. But what I wanted to tap into a little bit today was often these stories don't actually start with us. They start with the generation before us and the generation before them and the generation before them. Because the reality is most of this stuff gets passed down and eventually arrives at someone who's willing to break that cycle. And that takes a lot of effort to be the one who chooses to do things differently. So a lot of people skirt through life with not looking at any aspect of their story. They just accept it as who they are. They're not even willing to change. You know, that whole story that bad people do bad things and abuse people, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But that's not the whole truth, because there are people in that cycle who choose to do it differently. They choose to decide that they're not going to repeat that cycle. And the main reason I'm bringing up this topic of our stories don't start with us most of the time. And I'm actually going to revise that. No, probably all of the time, to be honest. I was just tapping into a childhood story then, you know, secondary school. And, you know, as I said, you probably don't even need to know the story to understand the capacity that the person who was making decisions behind that story had stories themselves. So hence why I'm saying most of the time our stories don't actually start with us. They start with the previous generation, and their stories start with the previous generation, XXX. As I said, already explained that. So, and the main reason I wanted to bring this up was because I had another layer show up for me around my mother wound. So I have been diving deep into my mother wound probably for a couple of years now, and probably more so since my father passed away. So, and I think that's just because my mum's left by herself, and so there's elements that come to the forefront, you know, all of those kinds of stuff. There's been a shift in dynamics, you know, all of those kind of things. And I had another layer come through this week, and it was interesting to say the least, but it also brought in another wave of awareness around stories I've told myself and how they're even layered. So stories that I had about money, not being able to afford things, not, you know, feeling like a burden, you know, all of those. Most of us have got those stories, you know, from that standpoint. I think there's very few people I come across that don't have some story around that. But, you know, particularly money stories, hence why my previous episode, you know, conversation was around money, you know, pricing doesn't determine your worth and all of that kind of stuff. And so stories that I had laid in there about money, about being bad at English, about being, you know, all sorts of things, came in with another layer of not feeling like I belonged. And I think we all acknowledge that that's what we want. We're, you know, foundationally relational beings by design. We're designed to relate to others. We're designed to be in a relationship with others. Some of us might think that we survive better when we're without others, due to, in part, our trauma stories and all of those kind of things. I was reading some stuff on Facebook about a broken relationship and how they never want to they currently don't want to deal with men. They don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. And other people piped in and said, yeah, exactly the same, feel the same, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So, and again, there's stories around all of those kind of things that, you know, separate and divide us and all of those kind of things. So but as I said, the recognition that also came through with some of those stories was how, in all likelihood, my mother and father's wounding came into those decision makings. And, you know, some of those were around gender, some of those were around, you know, childhood sibling sequences, you know, whether you were the first, last, you know, all of those kind of things, and determinants, you know, all of around worth, all of that kind of stuff. And again, I think the other thing that's important to acknowledge around stories is we add a layer ourselves from that standpoint. Because again, we obviously, one of my core questions that I ask a lot of people when I'm in sessions with them and things like that is, what have you made that mean about you, right? And I came across that questioning in some learnings that I had, and it has been one of those questions that has stuck with me exponentially in terms of my capacity to move through my stories without making judgments about it. There was literally like, what am I making this mean? Like, am I making this mean that I'm bad with money? Am I making this mean that, you know, I'm not good at my job? You know, all of those kind of things. Because I'm talking for myself here, but I've done a lot of deep diving around, particularly, as I said, work, money, you know, all of those kind of things, relationships. And yeah, the core question at the bottom of that is, what have I made it mean about me? And hence, as I said, this extra layering around belonging was not one that I was previously aware of in relationship to a lot of these stories. As I said, I already had the base around money, you know, value, good at my job, bad at my job, you know, all of those kind of things. Or someone was better because they were booked out and I wasn't, you know, all of those kind of things that can come into the service provision sector. And so, yeah, it was interesting to acknowledge that layer and added depth and another understanding. And the other thing is that I wanted to tap into, because I was just reading something else on Facebook that this is kind of in response to, and in addition to, because I was going to do this anyway, but it brought in another layer that currently all the rage is around somatic work, right? And I'm not diminishing or dismissing the need that we actually need to bring our body into the conversation, but there are some of us who need that mental talk therapy, understanding, self-awareness before we can let it go. And I'm one of those. So if somebody asks me to go into my body before I've understood it, I'm always going to struggle and it's not going to leave. And it's just like, you know, probably the same for those who do it very somatically and in their body. Asking them to get into their mind is probably not going to work very well either. So part of, you know, understanding our stories, understanding where other people's stories are coming from, because I think that helps us relationally, first and foremost, because I have a stronger capacity for compassion and empathy when I try and step into someone else's shoes and understand where they're coming from, what created that response, what brought that on. And maybe that's just the counselor in me, but there is, and the therapist, massage therapist, and all of that kind of stuff when I talk about pain. And I promise you I will be having some conversations around pain in different parts of the body and what that might mean and all of those kind of things. So it's not that I'm, you know, not saying that that's important, because clearly in my job it is. But we have to layer that conversation with, you know, and often it'll be some of the simplest questions when it comes to pain, for example, is, when did you first experience it? Or when did you last experience it? Is a common question of mine if somebody's coming through a flare-up or anything like that. What brought this on? Do you know what brought this on? Do you know when it started? Do you know all of those kind of things? Because when we've got that as a touch point, it helps us understand it better, and it helps us have potentially the capacity to let it go or not repeat those patterns. And so, yeah, we need to remember that, again, coming back to the stories conversation, and the reason I'm, you know, a big proponent and a big, you know, part of a lot of my work, if somebody's willing to dive into it, is around their stories, because I believe there's a lot of wisdom in them. I don't think they don't come out of nowhere. They come out of a relationship with someone else and a story that we've made out of that. And as I said, no one gets out of life without getting them. As I said, they might be smaller than someone else's. They might not be as traumatic as somebody else's, but they're all, and in regardless of that, because I mean, part of this conversation as well is that just because someone else's trauma is bigger doesn't diminish your trauma. And because someone would look at my life and go, I had a good education, I had a house, I had food, I had, all of that kind of stuff. And yet I've still come out with some stories that have created some significant, impact in my life, and how I respond and how I show up and all of those kind of things. And it wasn't until I started diving into them, and this has probably been, we're probably talking predominantly, 5 years ago. I have, this was 5-6 years ago, really diving into it. And particularly, obviously, when I started my counselling course back in 2021, after my father died, there was a lot of stuff going on there that I had created stories around, particularly with my work and where that stood in the community at the time, where it still stands in the community at the time, as I spoke in my previous message around massage not being seen in the same value entity as things like chiro, osteo, physio, all of that kind of stuff, particularly here in Australia. I can't talk about other countries. I can't talk about, all of that kind of stuff. It might be a different story. And moving my way through that and making decisions, like I can sit here and remember when I first studied, 25 years ago now, contemplating the thought of training to be an osteo, because we had an osteo teacher and it sounded great, all of that kind of stuff. And I was, 25 at the time, and I can, but there was an element of me that, there were aspects that I said, it was full-time study, so 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. It was like, how am I going to work with that? How am I going to earn money? How am I actually going to devote time to and so I wrote it off. And it wasn't until I came back 20 years later, and had time to sit and actually contemplate it. I wasn't distracted. I had nothing else to think about. I was clearly sitting in my home for 23 hours a day. So I had plenty of time for that mental contemplation, which, again, I'm not going to say is, if you've got too much time, probably not a good thing either. And sitting there going, I actually don't want to adjust backs all day. I actually really love the soft tissue work. I love that I get to spend an hour with my clients. I love that I get to deep dive into conversations with them. And it's not a superficial conversation. And if you know anything about me or anything you're going to learn about me, is that I am not superficial by nature. I am the one who likes to dive deep. I am the one who will dive deeper into your patterns than you've ever dived before. I will give you more understanding about yourself than you've probably had from other practitioners. Because that's what lights me up, is finding those patterns, finding that story, finding that wisdom in that story, all of that kind of stuff, finding the first time it happened, all of those kind of things. And so it was interesting to be able to let that go, that dream that I'd held on to for 21 years about wanting to be an osteo. And again, there were stories around that was more valuable, that was all of this, when in truth that actually wasn't what I wanted. Because there was probably a part of me that if I really wanted it, I could have made it work. Like I think that's the truth about any of those kind of action-taking steps, that if we really want it, and we've moved through some elements of it, that we will take action on it. Part of me doing this is it's been sitting there in the background for a little while, and I've had some other stuff going in the background. I was, there's been conversations with other women who, who've suggested that I share my voice, all of that kind of stuff. And I do think there's an element of me that is ready to share my voice. And it was interesting, I was reading the other day about the caves environment, which I have in my human design personally. And a lot of that is audio, and a lot of that is talk, podcasts, all of those kind of things. And so this feels like the natural progression and it's not about visibility, but it is about sharing my voice and adding a layer to the conversation. And as I said in my introduction, if you agree with me or disagree with me, that's fine. I fundamentally don't actually have a problem with open, constructive conversations. And some would say I have an open crown center, which means that there is a level of open-mindedness. Some might say because I have a defined ajna that not so open-minded, but then I do have the 4323 channel, which is called the channel, basically the freak to genius channel. So some of you listening to this are just going to think this is fantastic, that I'm a genius. I love that, and I love you. And then there are going to be others that listen to me and go, she's just weird, right? And again, fundamentally, none of that has anything to do with me other than creating a response in you. So if you're a manifesting generator or a generator and you're designed to respond, I'm the perfect match for you. Let's just say that. So again, coming back to our stories, and I don't want to make these too rigid and these conversations too rigid or anything like that. I just want to explore aspects of the fact that what we think is one part of the story, in truth, there is probably more layers to it than we're aware of in the moment. And I guess this is where part of that spiral conversation comes with healing and all of those kind of things. We can hit a plateau. I'm going to call it a plateau. We get to a space where we're pretty comfortable with the knowledge we've found out about ourselves and all of that kind of stuff. And then you get hit with something and you go, I thought I'd dealt with this, and now I'm on to, but the truth is you're dealing with it from a different spot, a different experience, different understanding. And this was me with that layer of belonging, like that whole conversation around, I'll just tell you the story around it. So in prep, I remember being excluded from dance classes and hearing from my mother that was because they couldn't afford it. And so I made that a money story, right? I made that, that I wasn't worth spending money on, and that, and that tracked with me for a large percentage of my life until I started doing some of this work and really realizing that was a story I was telling myself. And it's taken time to move through that and actually spend money on myself and all of that kind of stuff. And then another layer, kind of comes into that around belonging, because I was the only one in the class not included in that. And the potential is my mother has a different story around this conversation, right? But this is what I remember, or this is, as I said, the story I've created. And again, not making it right or wrong, good or bad, anything like that. It's the story I've created. Let's try and remain as neutral and curious as possible. And I highly recommend that with any story that comes up when you are triggered, is to remain in a space of curiosity and the capacity just to remain open to what comes through. And then, so not only in this last week, I've added that layer of belonging. I was the only one not included, clearly seen as different, all of those kind of things. And if I was to bring that forward to today, right, is particularly around networking. For me, business networking is not something that I fundamentally enjoy doing, because I do have quite different viewpoints on how business can be done. I am very much a people first as opposed to a profit first strategy. And I hit heads and butt heads and do all of that kind of stuff with a lot of people when it comes to that. They're like, how can't you include money in the equation? All of that kind of stuff. And as I've said previously, it's not about excluding money in the equation, but it is about making the person sitting in front of me the most important person in that moment. And a true belief that if I do that, then, things will flow and people feel valued, as opposed to being seen as a commodity. So anyway, that's probably a conversation for another session. And getting back to the story. So again, layered. But it's taken me to heal that money story, to see this belonging story come in and open up that awareness to, and hence the spiral. This was coming back to that spiral conversation, a new awareness from a different level of experience and a different capacity and all of those kind of things. So it has, so, and then there were other ones like I was put into special spelling classes in grade 4, I believe, grade 4, grade 5, somewhere in there. And then by grade 6, I'd been told, you know, I'd satisfied, you know, what they needed me to do, and I was all good to go back to participating in my regular class, only to hit high school and be asked to go back into remedial English. Hence my story around bad English, my writing, you know, all of that kind of stuff. That took a lot of work to put my writing out publicly, and then getting the feedback that people really liked my writing, and it was just like, oh. And also when I did my master's degree in nutrition, not getting bagged out for my writing, which had occurred in pretty much every other iteration of education. So and hence, as I said, I could move past that bad English story to see that there was also an exclusion story in there, because at that time I actually said, no, I'm not going back to special ed. I've been told I don't need to. I'm not doing that. I can remember the tears. I can remember the teacher telling me. It was a horrible experience. And then, you know, as part of that, I went back to, you know, the standard English class, only to be told, what are you doing here? You're not meant to be here. And I can still remember the person telling me that. And so there was that exclusion conversation that I'd never layered into this story. And so I think the important thing was that I was open to hearing that there was another layer to my story that I needed to mentally understand before, because I'm one of these, once I understand it, I can let it go. Like, I don't get here and bogged down in that, you know, bad English story, or, you know, I now just write. Like, I've got blogs on the website, I've got Facebook posts, I've got, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And here I am doing this. So, you know, there's elements that I've moved through without needing to do a hell of a lot of somatic work. And I to be truthful, I struggle a little bit with the somatic work, and as I said, much more mentally process is the way that I work. So, and here and so, as I said, I'm not diminishing any ways that somebody needs to work through their stories, work through their triggers, or any of those kind of things. So, but all I wanted to bring up again, as I said, is that often these don't start with us, because, as I said, there's elements of conversations when I, you know, went back, and because somebody asked me, where did this start? You know, so I had the questions that I ask, others asked of me, and when they asked, do you remember a time where this started? You know, one of the particular words was around being selfish. And it was probably pre-birth, right? So that means that's not me. Like, I didn't bring that story to fruition. You know, that came through, you know, part of my mother's story, part of my father's story, all of that kind of stuff, because I know some of my parents' story, and I can bring that into my stories, and recognizing, because one of the components that I recognized was that they were bringing their trauma forward into their family stuff. Because I guess the other thing that probably needs to be honored is that, generationally speaking, a lot of them weren't taught to process. A lot of them weren't taught to talk. A lot of them weren't. It was push on. It was suck it up, princess, and move on, and all of that kind of stuff. And we still hear those sayings these days. And so, yeah, so as I said, part of it is a need to honor that our stories, although, you know, relevant to us, probably didn't actually start with us. And if we can bring that understanding and capacity for, you know, as I said, I've done this primarily around my mother wound and my father wound and all of that kind of stuff. But it's also relevant to my money story, to my worth story, to all of those kind of things. So I just want to remind you that twofold. There's a couple of things. Again, remembering it probably didn't start with you, and I'm sure there is a book out there that I can't remember the exact title, but a lot of it is around that premise that it didn't start with you, that a lot of these trauma imprintings are coming from previous generations and all of that kind of stuff, and the genetic flow from other previous generations and their experiences getting bedded into their DNA and then passed on. And then second, just that curiosity to recognize that how you choose to process is your choice and perfectly fine. If somatic work isn't for you, that doesn't mean that it's not valid, but also don't diminish, because at the moment there's a big anti-talk therapy conversation that you don't actually need to do talk therapy to heal and all of that. But there are some of us out there that do actually process a lot verbally to gain understanding and awareness and all of those kind of things. So this isn't about saying one way is right or wrong or anything like that. It's just about having the capacity that what works for someone else may not work for you. And I say this to a lot of my clients as well. If a treatment's not working for you, that doesn't mean it's a bad treatment. It just means it's not right for you, right? So, because the premise behind that is that massage isn't for everyone. There are people who can't stand to be touched. And they're the kind of people clearly I don't want in the room in my massage room, because I have to navigate that far more than they probably realize. Like, if somebody gives them a gift voucher, it kind of shows how little they know about them. But if they give them a gift voucher, which I don't take anymore and part of it is because of this reason, is that if they don't want to be touched but they feel pressured to honor that gift voucher, there is nothing worse than being the practitioner in that room and navigating and, all of those kind of things when they really don't want to be there. So, and I wouldn't force anyone. I wouldn't force anyone to do that, all of those kind of things. So I think it's just important to recognize that a lot of us have our own ways of navigating our trauma stories, and that all healing is a level of healing that, just because you're not making leaps or bounds doesn't mean that things aren't working and things aren't shifting. Because I think in truth, and I've said this before, the subtle shifts and changes are the ones that last the longest. When we don't, even though I have the gate of shock, and I do shock some people and all of those good things, there is an element that, shock on a paradigm can be anything from, small to large, right? And I often have that conversation, as I said again, with clients, that the smallest changes you can make are that provide a bigger boost for, and I'll talk about diet here. I know I'm flipping and changing a lot, but so the small, let's say you're trying to lose weight, the smallest amounts of shifts and changes you need to make to lose weight are going to be the ones that run for the longest. If you have to chop out food groups, if you've got to increase exercise exponentially, it is unlikely to last a long time, and hence why people go through the yo-yo dieting and often end up in a worse metabolic state than if they just stayed the same. There is a lot of research out for that. So all I'm saying, as I said, background, stories are layered, often didn't start with us, and then how we heal and process them is also individual and finding what works for you. Don't be pressured into a system, a process that if feels jarring, and because that's going to keep you stuck in fight and flight, fawn or freeze mode in your traumatic response, because that's what we need to soften. We need to soften the nervous system response for you to become aware, to create shifts and changes. And I will preface that having a conversation with someone who sees and witnesses you at your core can be so transformational, and at the same time not diminishing the somatic side of things. And when people get in their body, and I have recently read that whole conversation about trauma being stuck in your body is that's a small part of the conversation. It's not a complete one. Might come back and have a conversation around that too. When people talk about trauma is stored in the body and all of those kind of things. So to me, it's probably stored in the brain, because there's different parts of your brain that store that emotional aspect, the verbal, the auditory, so the words you hear, the sounds you hear, and all of that may trigger a response in you is actually coming from the brain. But again, I think that's a conversation elsewhere. So I'm going to leave that here. But as I said, the part of the conversation I want you to hear most and foremost is, in all likelihood, although you experience your trauma, the trauma started probably before you were even alive, but it was passed on to you in, as I said, processes and ways and layers and all of that kind of stuff. And that's not to diminish it. Please do not hear that doesn't diminish your experience, because absolutely, we've all been, as I said, we've all got our stories. We've all got our trauma stories. And part of the healing process is acknowledging that there are layers to that, hence the spiral. And the more we can honor the direction of either winding back that spiral or inversely creating that spiral, because the change in the spiral shifts when we can probably undo some of the past. And so again, if they're, I'd love to hear if you've got any comments, to add them in the comment section, and I'll be back with another, layer or another conversation to stir some thoughts and consideration and open yourself to hearing different points of view.